Well, Ronald, I'm really happy we could get together today because, I've known your work for many years. I was an early subscriber to Automobile Magazine in the 80s, and, I read your stuff, and it was always humorous. I felt like your writing's never been mocking or snide, but it's always been sort of like bemused about cars, the industry, and life in general.
The word someone used once was sly for my sense of humor. And
I'll go with that.
yeah, and I like to sneak one in there, and even in the grocery store, if I can make the cashier and the other two customers laugh out loud, then I go home feeling wonderful, and it's always that kind of unexpected thing.
Were you writing early? Were you writing in high school and sort of...
I wrote a couple of letters to the editor when I was young. One of them when I was 15 to the Omaha World Herald, and I wrote directly to the sports editor, Wally Provost, and I was outraged because they didn't cover stock car racing. They gave so much coverage to minor league baseball, the Omaha Royals, and they'd get 2,700 in attendance for a game. And out at the stock car track, we had 3,000 people, and on Sunday night, and that was barely in the paper. And I protested that they should cover it more, and I never expected that this letter would be published. And we all read the paper every night, and there was my letter, part of it in Wally's column, and I was kind of mortified, really.
That wasn't just as a fan, right? There was a personal tinge to that, right?
Right. I mean, I grew up at the track, Sunset Speedway, northwest of Omaha, and also we went over across the river, the Missouri River, a lot to Playland Park Speedway.
And these are half-mile ovals?
No, they were Sunset Speedway, which opened in 1957, was a quarter-mile oval, dirt, and then in about 64, they expanded to 3/8 mile and started racing late models instead of the old, we called them stock cars. And here they were 32 Fords and so on. And so suddenly people were racing Chevelles and Fairlanes. But across the river in Council Bluffs, that was 1/5 of a mile paved. It had been a dog track. and Playland Park was, kind of midway rides and stuff, and a racetrack. And they were racing over there in 52, maybe even earlier. So that's where that local oval track culture came from. And Sunset, when they opened in 57, it was a big deal. They were getting 75 cars for a racing program.
Wow.
Yeah. And my father raced in 57 and 58, and he won 3 feature races one year and 2 the next, which made him it was really authenticating for him to win these races, and established him as a great authority on many things. And I think it also probably overcame a lot of maybe resistance within the family on my mother's side. Like, who is this heathen from a country boy, and
who does he think he is?
Yeah, and big know-it-all. And so he backed it up,
Right. So he probably walked around with his head held a little higher after that.
Absolutely, and he carried that with him for a long time. And then he had another run after Sunset did expand, and he was that was his second car. That was a 32 Ford sedan, because the coupe bodies were all gone, by then. And he wasn't very successful with that car, and that was not easy for him, that failure. And after that, he never really drove again. Except for a couple of rare occasions, but he was basically a crew chief after that. And racing was starting to get a lot more serious. Then he built a car in 74 with a man named Bob Hatterman, who had just won the super stock division at Sunset. He had a 57 Chevy with a 283 engine and a 2-barrel. And if you won your championship in your class, you had to move up to the pro division. And so my dad talked him into trying this crazy experiment with a complete space frame chassis out of steel tubing. And they welded it up and everything was beautifully triangulated. And he's trying for centralization of mass and all these things. And, you know, it was basically sports car technology, right? And he even moved the rear disc brakes inboard.
Oh, wow.
Oh, I know.
Very exotic.
And so the car was supposed to dance around the turns, you know, and he was always arguing with people about your spring rates should be lower. You need a stiffer chassis and softer springs, and you'll just, you know, around those corners. And poor Bob Hatterman had never raced in that big league, and it was a big step. And he had a pretty big accident at Corning, Iowa, I think, and they had to rebuild a lot of the space frame. And I don't think they even finished the season. And my dad had bought two 427 cubic inch engine blocks, which he built. And for some reason, he was pursuing this fueling strategy that left the mix too lean. And so he started melting pistons.
Right.
Oh, you know, and then they were rebuilding engines, and I think they just ran out of money and gave up by the end of the season. And he never raced again after that. Never was involved in racing, and really turned to digital technology. And he found it very rewarding to get an input and know what the output would be. And he was often seen running around with his ohm meter and his, you know, he loved to do measurements and testing and to solve problems.
So he was a frustrated backyard engineer, really, in a way.
Yeah. My dad, Walter Carl Ahrens Jr., was like I said, country boy from the Loup River country in Nebraska and near Columbus, and dropped out of high school, but he always liked to read, and he read the screwdriver books, as we call them, Popular Mechanics and Popular Science or whatever he picked up. And he was very good at absorbing all of that kind of information, not only about, you know, engineering technology, but also astrophysics and all of those big things. And he did enroll and took courses at Omaha University. Didn't matter that you didn't have a high school diploma, but he wasn't much of a student. And this is while he was married and after I was born even. And even in 57, 58, when he was racing, they listed, you know, in the newspaper when they wrote about him, they listed him as a student. So that's why I say on my website that he considered himself intellectually superior to these other guys at the track who mostly, you know, they owned filling stations or repair shops and farmers, you know, and those were his competitors. And they were, Omaha, Nebraska was a very ethnic town, you know, with a wave after wave of migrants who came to work in the stockyards, you know. And some of their names are remembered today in the annals of Daytona International Speedway. If you go back to the very first race, it was won by Lee Petty, and second place was Johnny Beauchamp from Council Bluffs, Iowa, and the car owner was Roy Burdick from Omaha. And the Burdicks had been a very dominant racing family, and I would say they were probably Bohemians. And the other dominant driver going back into the early 50s was Bob Koziski, and he raced in 1960 at Daytona. And so we had that heritage, and honestly, my dad felt like he belonged there too, you know, and
right.
And he knew how to run a slide rule as well, so you know he really belonged, and so that kind of exalted notion of himself. In addition, he read sports car magazines, so this is where he knew about space frame tech, you know, design. And
Colin Chapman stuff.
Colin Chapman. I mean, he talked to me about Colin Chapman all the time. You know, here I am 8 years old and I'm listening to him think out loud. And, you know, Colin Chapman's motto was simplify and add lightness. So I was always hearing about lightweight cars, and our personal cars in our family were, he had a 1959 Volvo 544, PV 544, and it was kind of a crazy choice for a 27-year-old guy with a family, and Volvos were just finding their way into the heartland by then. You know, they started on the coasts and then gradually opened dealerships in places like Omaha. And we also had a Nash Metropolitan, and I have an old photo of both of those cars in our driveway. So there was all this kind of crazy experimentation going on as well.
Obviously, it was an early way for you to relate to your dad, but you genuinely became interested in cars. You became a gearhead.
Oh, no. I was 2 years old in 57, and I went to the track. And,
yeah.
My mother told me that I called the cars putt-putts, and that I could also fall asleep during a race. You know, I mean, it was just home for me, and I loved it. And being around all of these, these men who, they were really feeling it with what they were doing. You know, that was a great way for people to express themselves.
Yeah. Those little ovals out in the country, there's nothing like it. That is really the lifeblood of racing in the United States. People don't realize it in the city. You know, they think about F1 Miami and Daytona and Talladega, but those little itty bitty half-mile ovals.
And look who comes from places like that, sliding around on the dirt. You have names like Mears and Jimmy Johnson from El Cajon, you know, and they learn how. And Tony Stewart was one who said, you know, I like a car that moves around. And he did the NASCAR thing. I don't think his spirit was really ever there. Look what he did with his money. He bought Eldora Speedway, you know,
right.
And there's just something about the action on the tracks, and then the whole social side. So, you know, I would be left up in the grandstands. Sometimes my mom came along. Sometimes I was just there. And, you know, here I'm 8, and you come down to the last lap of the 25 lap A feature, and you know, here is Bud Burdick leading Bob Koziski on the back straightaway of the final lap, and there's going to be contact in turns 3 and 4, right? And everybody knew it, and they would all be on their feet, and they would be jabbing their cigarette into the air and trying not to spill their beer out of the cup. And as soon as the contact occurred, and you know, Burdick moved up the track and Koziski went under, you goddamn son of a bitch, you know, and they didn't care if an 8-year-old was present or not. But this is how people release their emotions, you know.
Oh yeah.
And otherwise, you had to be so self-contained, you know, in society. So that's the cool thing about racing, is that, you know, there's something thrilling and visceral that's going to happen, and people will lose their minds.
Yeah. Well, not to mention in small town America, you know, those two guys that are dicing it out went to high school together, and maybe that guy stole the other guy's girl, you know, stuff like that.
Well, you know, Omaha was a medium-sized city, 300 and some thousand when I was a kid. So a lot of them probably did come from the same neighborhoods, but they got a lot of news coverage. And even in the 50s, I think the races at Playland Park Speedway were broadcast on live television.
Wow.
So they were household names. And my dad was pictured in the newspaper, you know, and again, completely legitimized before his family. And, you know, everybody took him seriously because of it.
Fast forward to after college, and you've got Hollywood aspirations, right?
Yeah. Well, you know, I grew up watching Johnny Carson, and his first job was in Omaha in the early 50s, and he was born in an Iowa town, and then they moved up to Norfolk, Nebraska. So for somebody from University of Nebraska as well, and somebody like him to make it that big, had quite a powerful effect as well. And Dick Cavett was from Lincoln. So, Nebraska people, they're real easy to talk to because they never come down hard on one side of the question or the other, and if you ask them if they were involved, they'll say, well, I might have done that if I would have been there. Everything's conditional. So they make excellent talk show hosts, and Johnny Carson was this overawing figure, and hope that's a word. And so anyway, I ran away after getting an English degree at Nebraska and was going to be a screenwriter. I actually was accepted into a program at USC, which I couldn't afford, and I dropped out after the first semester, and ended up holding cue cards on television productions. Actually worked on one show that was a network special on NBC, tribute to Jack Benny, who had died, and it was Johnny, Bob Hope, and George Burns.
Wow.
And I was holding cue cards for them,
Wow.
So, and working at NBC regularly on Days of Our Lives on Stage 9, I could go over to Stage 1 at 5:30. They would usually finish by 5:15. So I'd just wait and then go over to Stage 1, and there was a employee viewing area just off the set to watch Johnny do his monologue. I don't know, I did that 100 times, But to start, my start in writing was I'd already written a bit for the college newspaper, and then I wrote a story for Soap Opera Digest about how we did cue cards on Days of Our Lives, and somebody handed me a camera so that I could take pictures to go with this thing, and they published all of it,
Well, they say write what you know, yeah?
Yeah, right. And so that was how I started writing for magazines, and there was a certain amount of bouncing around until 1985, and my wife, I'd gotten married, my wife Susan and I were sitting around in St. George, Utah, renting a condo from her mom, and we had cable. So I started watching IndyCar racing, and they were advertising for Auto Week magazine. Get your subscription. So I did, and it was still a big newspaper back then. So cool. And there was a little item saying that this man I'd never heard of, David E. Davis Jr., who had left Car and Driver, was going to start a new magazine with backing from Rupert Murdoch, and it was going to be called Automobile. And he announced this to the Automotive Press Association in Detroit at a meeting, and he offended everybody by saying, and we're not going to cover racing because no one cares. So I thought, hey, sounds like a job opportunity. I don't know, I'll send a resume 2,000 miles away. And I never thought about it again. Like 3 weeks later, the phone rings, and it's Jean Lindemood, as she was then known, today Jean Jennings. And could you come to Ann Arbor for an interview? And I'm like, you mean you're going to pay for my ticket and you're going to fly me there, and hotel and dinner and all that? So, and I got a job as associate editor. So we moved, and that was, we arrived November 1st of 85, and there were, in this nascent organization, there were 5 employees at that time, and I was number 6, I would say. And so we went into the car magazine world that way.
Well, now, so launching it, did you feel pressure to wow them initially, or was it just a little bit of an easier entry because this was a new publication?
No, I felt pressured, and they hired me because they liked my sentences, but I had never majored in journalism or studied journalism, and I didn't know anything. I had been a freelancer, so I had no idea what an editor did. And as far as trying to build it together, I was really kind of on my own, and I was supposed to edit the news department, and I just floundered. I failed, and so they got rid of me after 6 months. Meanwhile, the first issue had come out in March. I think it was March of '86. So there'd been this build-up period. By the time the second issue came out, I had lost my job. But they asked me, as they're getting rid of me, to just continue as a contributor, as a freelance contributor, and do the list of auction results that I had been already doing. Vintage car auctions. That was something David E. wanted to cover. And he liked what we'd done so far. So I did that for 10 years. And I traveled. I used their cars from their press fleet, and traveled to Scottsdale for the Barrett-Jackson auctions, and also obscure regional auctions, just so that I'd have enough material to put into that column, because those companies didn't really have much PR back then, and we were just starting to use fax machines, so that was a convenient way to get some auction results. But if it was a good auction, I would go myself, And so I traveled around a lot, and it was a really good way to get educated about the American automobile in particular, and all automobiles in general. One of my first features in automobile was a story that I called A Little Gumbo Mumbo Jumbo.
I love it.
And it was about this man named George Bentley, who is from Lafayette, Louisiana, and George Bentley Cars specializes in Jaguars, and everybody knows this guy, and he'd like to take me under wing and tell me the inside scoop on things, and he was just such an extravagant character that I finally wrote, without even telling him. It was more like a memoir type piece, and we got Gary Hovland to do a great illustration, and Gary and we teamed up a number of times. But so there were characters, and through them, it was almost like listening to my dad too, get their take on whether that model Jaguar was worth your trouble, and stuff like that.
I love that stuff. That's one of the things that set the magazine apart from, let's say, Car and Driver, where you'd have, lots of specs. Yeah. Lots of engineering focus.
Right. David wanted the automobile to be features based and not a large staff with a lot of contributors, a lot of freelance contributors. And for that, he went to Car, magazine in England. He really admired Car magazine. And so we had Phil Llewellyn writing for us, and
that's right.
Mel Nichols was a columnist for a while, and we also got their photographers, because by their standards, automobile paid a lot. So they would fly over, and Martin Goddard, and he would get a month in the U.S. and we want you to do this shoot of our new car that we're testing, but also here's one that we're testing for a year, and we'd like you to shoot that for the final wrap-up story. And then could you go down while you're in the United States and do a travel story with Ronald. And then so those guys, Colin Kerwood, Dougie Firth, and there were some others who did regular work for Automobile, and they were good. They had a lot of style.
Now let's talk about David E. Davis, because I think he's a pretty fascinating character. He was a self-styled dandy, a little bit of a raconteur. Had a bad accident, I think, in the early '60s racing.
Yeah. It was in the '50s.
Yeah.
Right, and there was madness for sports car racing, especially here on the West Coast. And he turned an MG over, and basically he suffered serious facial injuries.
Right.
And, he really didn't look that bad. And I'm sure, though, he was a very dashing 6'4" hombre,
Yeah.
and he was about 25 when that happened.
Right.
So can't imagine the destructive impact on your self-image, but he, if anything, he overcompensated by, he was still a 6'4" commanding kind of person who, he bragged about his Savile Row tailoring, and he always had, a nice tie with a foulard pattern, or a Homburg, and he even affected a cane, a walking stick, and
of course there was the mustache and beard, which was always impeccably manicured.
Yeah.
And also it served to cover up some facial disfigurement.
Right. He did the right thing, and he made himself into a commanding presence who, especially men were really captivated by this guy, and he was kind of loud, and he talked a lot. You knew he was there, and he basically controlled the conversation wherever he went. And I would, be off at some podunk auction somewhere, and usually people didn't know who I was or what Automobile Magazine was. At that level, they're more like into Cars and Parts magazine or something,
Right.
But the few who did, they would kind of pull me aside and say, what's he really like, In fact, a crazy story is that these two guys at Scottsdale, they said, why don't you come over to our motorhome and we'll make you a steak? And this is what they wanted to know, was what David was like. But when I got to the motorhome, they had this hooker there. They called her Turbo. It was kind of awkward for me because I felt like I should make conversation with her too. And I'm sure these two guys are thinking, what kind of an idiot are you? So being in David's shadow was, it was always, I guess there was a little bit of glory that, you
were basking in his glow.
Somewhat, yeah. But
now,
and he was a great writer. He had sound compositional technique and some real style that came from his, extensive reading, but also he was from a Southern family. He was from Kentucky with the great oral storytelling tradition, and his aunt, Harriet Arnau, was a famous novelist, and she lived in Ypsilanti, Michigan, and she told the story of the Kentucky Hill people who came north when Henry Ford said $5 a day. Kentucky and Tennessee emptied out, $5 a day, and so she chronicled that in her novels, and and I think she maybe propelled him a little bit.
Yeah.